MacroWikinomics is a new book about rebooting the world by Don Tapscott and Anthony Williams.
I'm here with Don Tapscott, the author of the new book MacroWikinomics, and the subtitle of which, fittingly enough for this show, is Rebooting Business and the World. Don, why do you think business and the whole world are in need of rebooting?
Well, I don't think we're just in some kind of great recession or fallout from a financial meltdown. I think that we're in a turning point in human history, that many of the institutions that have served us well for decades or even centuries can no longer do so. They're frozen. And on the other hand, we've got a wonderful opportunity to rethink all of these institutions around a whole new model and a new set of principles. And that's provided to us by the Internet. If you want a comparison, you don't go back to 1982 or something like that. You go back a few hundred years to the transition between agrarian feudal society and industrial capitalism. Prior to the printing press, knowledge was held in a tiny oligopoly, and people had no information. When the printing press appeared on this scene, it didn't make sense for a bunch of kings and nobles to be in charge of everything. So we had the rise of parliamentary democracy. There was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther called the printing press God's greatest act of grace. The creation of the modern university, the corporation, eventually the Industrial Revolution, and a whole new set of institutions, and they were great for centuries. Now they're stalled. The old industrial economy has finally run out of gas, and that's why we need to reboot.
This is the follow-up to your first book, Wikinomics. Just to clarify, I was wondering if you could explain what you mean when you talk about Wikinomics.
Wikinomics was the theory and practice of collaborative innovation, and it was applied to the corporation. And we argued that the corporation is going through the biggest change in at least a century in its deep structures and architecture, in the way that we orchestrate capability to innovate, to create goods and services. Now what's happening as the whole global economy is transformed, we need to make these transformations throughout society. In the book, MacroWikinomics, we talk about 15 institutions that need to change, and they range from not just the corporation, but government, healthcare, newspapers that are collapsing. These are examples of some of the institutions that we tackle in the book, and for each of these, we show the contours of a new open networked model based on collaboration, based on sharing of intellectual property, on the concept of interdependence for a global economy and society. The book is not a futuristic book. It tells what's happening today all around the world. There are sparkling initiatives and examples of people who are just participating in whole new ways to solve problems, to not just to innovate and create wealth, but to create public value.
Wikinomics came out 4 years ago, and at the time, the idea of mass collaboration was pretty new. And it seems like already 4 years later, it's being applied to some of the biggest problems out there. Do you feel like the landscape has changed that much, or was this already sort of going on when you wrote the first book?
Well, it was already going on, but this economic meltdown has created a burning platform in a whole bunch of institutions. Many of these ideas in macroeconomics were ideas in waiting. They were waiting for the new web to mature, for a new generation of digital natives to come into the workforce and into the market and into society to become citizens. They were waiting for the social networking explosion to really take hold. When we wrote Wikinomics, there were 50 million people on Facebook. There are 500 million people just 4 years later. Social networking is becoming social production, and now social networks, blogs, wikis, jams, idea storms, microblogging like Twitter. These are all becoming the new operating system for a company and the new platform for a government or for other organizations and institutions to be able to operate. This is a very profound transformation that's underway.
You're listening to the Penguin Business Beat. Learn more at portfolioimprint.com. And now back to our interview with Don Tapscott. I was wondering if you could speak to what you see as being the most controversial recommendation you make in the book.
Of the 15 institutions we look at macroeconomics, every one of them has very controversial directions. I'm convinced that this is the way the world is going, and so is Anthony Williams, my co-author, because we've been researching the new models that are emerging. But for example, in the financial services industry, we think that risk management should be placed in the commons. We need a Linux or human genome of risk management. We think that the record industry should stop trying to sell songs and music as a product and instead should make music a service. We think in the healthcare industry, you need to move away from our old paternalistic model of healthcare towards something we call collaborative healthcare. When you're born, everybody should get a website, and it's half electronic healthcare record and half health social network, sort of like a big Facebook and database for healthcare with a news feed and access all kinds of information and enabling you to collaborate and to take responsibility for healthcare. In the university, we think the professor should stop lecturing. The lecture is the process whereby the notes of the lecturer go to the notes of the student without going through the brains of either. The model of pedagogy is the best model that we have for 17th century technology. You know, when it comes to democracy, we think that elections are a very limited way of engaging citizens in political life.
So you say you want to get rid of lectures in universities. What would be the new model to replace that?
It's called collaborative learning. In Virginia Tech, they've got rid of all math lectures. Kids learn math on interactive programs in a beautiful building called the Math Emporium. And the purpose of the prof is to structure a highly custom learning experience rather than to be a transmitter of data. Math lectures are a bad idea anyway. Everyone in the class is either bored or else they don't get it. Yeah. There's no one-size-fits-all for math. And again, this is not a theory. We talk about what's really happening today in leading institutions to totally rethink the model of pedagogy.
In the financial institutions, you want risk models and data to be available to everyone everywhere, or just people who are working within the industry?
The initial problem that the industry faces is that they have $1 trillion, plus or minus $1 trillion, of so-called toxic assets on their balance sheets. These are all these collateralized debt obligations that came from the subprime mortgage crisis. And that's created so-called zombie banks, or banks won't lend money. So how do we fix this? Well, you need to find a way to figure out what the value of these assets is. And you can't so-called mark to market because no one wants to buy them, and you can't mark to model because no one's going to trust a bank to tell you what these things are worth. So we're at a logjam here. So what do? We need to take these assets, place them in the commons, and initially open them up to all of the financial modelers in the world. I don't know, there may be tens of thousands of people that might be interested in this. And then to use a collaborative process to determine what the real value of these assets is. And then we can clear up the balance sheets of the banks, and the industry can start to be reborn on a whole new model. That would be an initial step towards rethinking risk management, where we would create a human genome of risk management. So the banks all say, well, no, our risk management models, they're the foundation of our competitive advantage. Well, hello, they hardly conferred competitive advantage. Collectively, they almost destroyed the entire industry.
Some would argue the reason that so many of these banks failed is that JP Morgan did go open source with their value at risk model, and people just sort of started using it without really understanding it.
Well, I just don't think that's true. The reason the industry fell fundamentally was because there was a violation of one of the 5 principles of economics, which was integrity. This industry needs a lot more than, some new regulation. It needs a whole new modus operandi.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks a lot.